13th annual meeting of the Society. I hope you've had a great meeting, as I have. This has been really powerful, the different sessions of bringing people together. And we're going to conclude with an incredibly powerful session. I just wanted to make a quick announcement. Of course, we continue to have activities, and since this is it's co-sponsored with the Hague and the Asser Institute, we're having our meeting in Geneva, inaugural meeting of ASIL Abroad on June 5th to 6th, if you might be able to make it. So let me just say a few things. The Hague long has had a special connection, of course, to international law and international institutions, being the home of the International Court of Justice and so many other international tribunals and other institutions. This is the 13th year now that the Society has collaborated with its partners in The Hague to bring leading figures from around the world to our annual meeting here. I just want to thank Deputy Mayor for International and Humanitarian Affairs, Marielle Levavier, and the municipality of The Hague, and the International Affairs Department and the TMC Asser Institute for International and European Law for their support and sponsorship of this important concluding plenary session. I'm now proud to announce Deputy Mayor Marielle Levavier.
Thank you, Greg. And it's a very big pleasure to be here. Thank you so much. And good morning, everybody. This year, half of the world's population will be represented at elections. Many are worried that 2024 will be a make or break year for democracy. The number of conflicts around the world have risen since we've met in ASIL last year, 2023. And against the backdrop of this are brave journalists, trying to do their work to the best of their ability, to keep people informed of the facts on the ground, and to hold those that hold the power to make decisions to account, honestly and objectively. According to Article 19 of the UN Universal Declaration of Human Rights, everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression without interference. But we know that many journalists around the world do not enjoy this basic human right and are confronted with increasing threats, intimidation, and violence. In many ways, journalists guard international law and human rights. In some places, they are the only source of information for international organizations and citizens alike. But who in turn protects the rights of these human rights defenders? UNESCO has been monitoring press freedom since 1993. Their statistics tell us that over 1,600 journalists have been killed since then. In the first months of this year, around 100 already have been killed trying to do their jobs. So I am very grateful that ASIL has agreed to close off this year's annual meeting with this timely discussion. The safeguarding of journalists and addressing impunity for crimes committed against them deserves attention at conferences like these. As the international city of peace and justice and legal capital of the world, The Hague sees the effects of freedom of expression daily. As the seat of the Dutch government and host to a wide range of international organizations, we have demonstrations of all sizes on all kinds of issues every day. We also host many initiatives related to the protection of journalists, both as a policy and as a practical level. Our fantastic TMC Asser Institute regularly brings together legal experts from the public and private sector for policy discussions on press freedom. Since 2021, the Shelter City program of the NGO Justice and Peace provides safe spaces to journalists coming from countries where freedom of expression is restricted. They also have specific programs for female journalists who in some situations, countries are even more at risk. The Hague is proud of its track record as a meeting point for giving a voice and finding solutions to such global challenges. From the first The Hague Peace Conference in 1890, which this year celebrates its 125th anniversary, to more recent summits like the World Press Freedom Conference we hosted in 2020. It was in part due to the efforts of journalists that the Hague Peace Conference were a success. While they took place behind closed doors among the old boys network of yesteryear, journalists were the driving force of the peace movement, increasing pressure to the negotiating parties to stop the arms race that gripped the world at the time. They were called the Apostles of Peace then. Today, in times of fake news, disinformation, and deepfakes, good and objective journalism has only become a bigger necessity. Thank you to the Esser Institute for organizing this closing plenary. I look forward to hearing the panel's views on how international law might contribute to laying the groundwork for better protection of journalists. In the current context of shrinking civil space and the rapid deterioration of situation of journalists worldwide, this is needed more than ever. Thank you.
I also just remembered that I forgot to thank one other person. How many cities have an international affairs department with a policy director? But Pepijn Zalman, thank you so much as well for helping to coordinate and do this with us. Now I'm going to introduce our moderator and the convener of this great panel, and that is Gabrielle Hilvikaita. Do my best I can. Thank you so much. This is the hardest part of being president, is getting all the names right and pronouncing them. Gabrielle is an international criminal law researcher at the Esser Institute. She's currently on loan from the University of Amsterdam. She coordinates international criminal law projects and conducts research on fact-finding and international criminal investigations and prosecutions. Gabrielle leads the Esser Institute's role in restoring dignity and justice in Ukraine, a Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs funded project. She's also the principal research for a feasibility study of an international investigative task force for crimes against journalists. Prior to her current role, Gabrielle was assistant professor at VU Amsterdam, co-director of the Center for International Criminal Justice, and PhD researcher at the Netherlands Institute for the Study of Crime and Law Enforcement. She has also been an analysis assistant with the Office of the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court and has worked on the independent expert review of the Rome Statute system in a research role. Gabrielle, thank you so much for convening us.
Thank you, and thank you for the kind introduction and my whole biography. I might be a little bit more spare with our panelists. We have 3 distinguished panelists with us today, and I would like to first introduce them before we open the discussion. Right next to me is Catherine Emerfar, who is co-chair of the International Dispute Resolution and Public International Law Groups of Debevoise and Plimpton LLP, and also the immediate past president, now no more immediate, now there's been some change for my notes, president of the American Society of International Law, and currently serves as deputy chair of the high-level panel on media freedom, the independent advisory body of the Media Freedom Coalition, which we will, of course, return to during the discussion. Evelyn Wijkstra, I'm going alphabetically here, leads Free Press Unlimited's policy and advocacy work on promoting press freedom and a safe and viable work environment for journalists. She is also the project lead for A Safer World for the Truth, which is aimed at pursuing justice for murdered journalists through investigations into cold cases, and the Organization of People's Tribunal on the Murder of Journalists. And last but definitely not least is Jen Yegensu, who's a practicing English barrister and the other deputy chair of the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom, currently representing Nobel Peace Laureate Maria Ressa, and is lead counsel for Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights before the European Court of Human Rights. Of course, I could say much more about the panelists, but I think in the interest of having the discussion, I will stop here. And just to provide some context, thank you, Marielle, for already touching upon many of the issues that we have been hearing about and that we work on in the context of protection of journalists and impunity for crimes against them. Let me spend a couple of minutes on the situation of media workers today. As is stated in the title of this discussion, journalists worldwide are confronting escalating threats, intimidation, and violence, whether in the throes of armed conflict or within increasingly authoritarian contexts, as well as in seemingly peaceful situations. And here we may be reminded of the late Jamal Khashoggi, Don Phillips, and Bruna Pereira, among many others whom the media attention perhaps skipped. In December 2023, the UNESCO sounded an alarm over the deaths of journalists who work in conflict zones, with killings almost doubling over the past 3 years. This trend has been exacerbated by a record toll of journalists killed in the Israel-Gaza conflict since 7 October 2023. The consequence of these intensified conflicts and related destruction of lives and media infrastructure creates, in the words of UNESCO Director General, zones of silence, which have severe consequences for access to information locally, which in situations of conflict can be life-saving, and for the world at large, which also relates to accountability for killings and other human rights violations. The increase in journalists killed in situations of declared armed conflicts overshadows a likewise serious situation in a number of non-conflict contexts, including killings and other human rights violations in relation to general violence, drug cartels, organized crime, as well as environmental reporting. Talking of accountability, impunity for killings of journalists persists at a rate above 85% over the last 15 years. Many explanations for this state of affairs have been offered. Issues of capacity, that is a lack of technical competence and staff able to conduct complex investigations, as well as issues of willingness, or political willingness, fear, coercion, and willful ignorance of going after those silencing media workers worldwide. And this is where the work towards creating an international investigative task force for crimes against journalists comes in. This work has been in the making for the last several years, and because we are lucky to have the deputy chairs with us on the panel, I will not spend much time on it, and we'll get into it in the discussions. But I would like to highlight that besides the work towards the creation of an investigative task force, many organizations around the world have been drawing attention to issues of journalist protection and the rampant impunity, and working towards shifting this trend by resorting to law, including international law. And I hope that we'll be able to provide a complex understanding of the multifaceted efforts required to combat impunity and ensure the safety of journalists globally, and the interdependency of local and international actors and of domestic and international law in supporting these efforts. As this is a very broad issue, I would like to first turn to Jen. The efforts towards the creation of the investigative task force, specifically focusing on journalists and media workers, have been, as I mentioned, ongoing for several years and are reflected in the work of the high-level panel. Could you provide us with some insight into how this work came about, what was the impetus, and how did we get to the point where a feasibility study is being conducted for setting up this task force? Thank you.
Gabrielle, thank you very much. And thank you also for convening this panel on a matter of great importance for us all. So let me start by providing some broader context. In 2019, a group of states got together and created something called the Media Freedom Coalition. It's now a coalition which is 50 states strong. And really the concept at Genesis was that things were getting more and more difficult for journalists. Things were getting more and more difficult for independent media. And of course, this was before disinformation was at the stage that it is now, and misinformation was at the stage as it was now. So the thinking was that this group of states would provide real energy within the UN and regional frameworks to promote and protect media freedom in the face of some of the challenges that Gabriella, the Deputy Mayor, have set out for you this morning. Now, the way in which this coalition was established was by reference to 3 pillars. The first pillar was the states themselves, and they were co-chaired initially by Canada and the United Kingdom, and then it was Canada and the Netherlands, and then Netherlands and Estonia, and today the Media Freedom Coalition of States is co-chaired by Estonia and Germany. So that's the first pillar. The second pillar was the high-level panel of legal experts on media freedom. And this was a body, an independent body, established really to provide expert legal advice to the states, both at a bilateral level as well as a bloc. And that body is chaired by Lord Neuberger of Abbotsbury, the former president of the UK Supreme Court. And Catherine and I have the privilege of serving as its deputy chairs today. The third pillar is the coalition's consultative network. This is the media freedom and civil society organizations, the real experts on the ground, providing assistance to independent media organizations as well as journalists. And very, very pleased, my friend Evelyn is here from Free Press Unlimited, a former co-chair of the consultative network and a real energizing force within the coalition. Now back to the high-level panel for a moment, because I'm going to take you to the investigative task force and how we have arrived at the position we are today. The panel's legal advice has really taken the form of reviewing domestic legislation for members of the Media Freedom Coalition, the individual states. It's taken the form of advising on specific legal issues that states come to us with. And the panel has also been approached by international courts and tribunals to intervene in individual cases where there are media freedom issues at stake. But as I said a moment ago, and this is important, we also advise these states as a bloc. And here what we sought to do in 2019, and in very difficult circumstances, of course, in 2020, with COVID raging, we sought to draw up a clear and detailed roadmap for states towards a principled response to some of the challenges that Gabrielle's articulated. Challenges that have not gone away and challenges that are, in fact, unfortunately, proliferating. But the principled response, we felt, required strengthening protections for journalists, but also punishing those who persecute them. And that was not only us, that was also the consensus amongst the Media Freedom Coalition of states. And we said that we could do that in at least 4 ways in the first instance. And we produced 4 advisory reports to the Media Freedom Coalition as a bloc. The first was on safe refuge for journalists at risk. Protecting journalists from harm means getting them out of harm's way when they face imminent danger. We made detailed recommendations to states in a report that I authored on the panel's behalf, and the headline recommendation in that report was the creation of a first-of-its-kind emergency visa for journalists at risk. And happily, that is a recommendation that states have started to give effect to. We have Canada that has moved in that area. We have the Czech Republic. We have Lithuania. We have Estonia. We have Germany. And we have several others, we hope, in the pipeline. But just to give you a sense of the impact of all of this, more than 1,400 emergency visas were not only created, but issued in 2022 by 8 Media Freedom Coalition states. If you take a step back, this mechanism didn't exist, and it does now, and these numbers are not derisory. Secondly, we said that states ought to commit to protecting their own journalists abroad through strengthening diplomatic and consular support if those journalists are arbitrarily arrested or face similar abuse. And we made detailed recommendations in a report authored by Professor Irving Kotler on behalf of the panel. Thirdly, we advised in a report authored by the inaugural deputy chair of the high-level panel, Amal Clooney, that punishment should include targeted financial and travel sanctions against those who will choose to persecute journalists. And that was one of our responses to the issue of impunity and accountability. And finally, and most importantly perhaps for today, our second response as a panel to the problem of immunity and accountability was informed by the principle that those who kill and falsely imprison journalists must be identified and prosecuted, and that currently the United Nations and regional mechanisms lack a standing body to independently investigate such abuses, and that there should be, in our view, an international task force that can investigate violence and other abuses against journalists when authorities on the ground are either too slow, too ill-equipped, or too politicized to act. So our recommendation as a panel for a multilateral investigative task force set out in a brilliant report authored by Nadim Houri, and I should say all of these recommendations that we made were endorsed by the UN Special Rapporteur, all of the regional mandate holders, as well as all major civil society organizations working to promote and protect media freedom, as well as, of course, UNESCO. Moving just to the investigative task force and what has happened since we made these recommendations and report. Well, the high-level panel has been working very closely with Free Press Unlimited and also happily with the Kingdom of the Netherlands, as well as some of our other partners, to see what can be done to turn these recommendations into actions. And in October of 2022, there was a parliamentary motion that was submitted in the Netherlands to support the creation of an independent task force to give effect to some of the high-level panel's recommendations. This was followed in December 2022 with the Kingdom of the Netherlands committing to provide financial support for further consideration of an investigative task force. And this was formally announced by then Foreign Minister Hoekstra at the Second Summit for Democracy in March 2023. And in November of last year, on the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, the Netherlands unveiled the two leading academic institutions that would be undertaking further work in this area, the Asser Institute and VU Amsterdam, which I think brings us to today, Gabrielle, and back to you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving a complete overview of how we got to this point where we are today. And I think it is very clear that the issue of protection of journalists and safeguarding them is multifaceted in terms of, on the one hand, we have the prevention and protection work, and on the other hand, we still have to focus on punishing and deterrence through that way. So throughout the conference, we have been hearing about the different ways that international law is being leveraged to respond to human rights violations, also, again, both in the protection side of things and in the response after violations have occurred. So I would now like to turn to Catherine and ask, what are your views on the state of play of using international law and perhaps also international criminal law to respond to serious crimes and human rights violations of media workers? And what are the limitations or perhaps missing pieces in international legal architecture?
Well, thank you very much. And I have to say it's a real pleasure and privilege to be here on the closing plenary. I know on behalf of ASIL that the collaboration with the City of The Hague with Asser Institute has been longstanding and much valued. So thank you so much. And thank you also for the attention on this issue. I'd like to tell you that international law has been the magic bullet in accountability when it comes to media freedoms and their protection. But as we all know, and we've been discussing in earnest over the last several days, there are limitations. But I cannot emphasize enough that having the international legal architecture on which to build has been vital, critical in what moves that we've made going forward. And as you've heard from Jan, much of the limitations, the missing pieces, as you've put it, has been the focus of the high-level panel's work over the last several years since the creation of the Media Freedom Coalition. So when we're thinking about what are the missing pieces, you can see them in the 4 enforcement reports around emergency visas. What are we trying to address there? Where we know that journalists get into trouble, not just in armed conflict, but in the ordinary course. They need extraction. They need opportunities to escape the harassment and the targeting that they're experiencing. And that's where the emergency visas came in. We're thinking about sanctions. How can we strengthen the global sanctions networks in order to deal specifically with media freedom issues? We're thinking about consular access, as you can imagine, to assist these reporters on the ground when they need it most in real time. You have to have really robust consular services that are attuned to the particular crisis and the particular urgency that reporters face. And of course, there's the failure of accountability, which I want to return back to. So these are the missing pieces. Those enforcement reports are really the high-level panel's assessment of how and where and why we need to build on the existing international architecture. So the question is more, what makes media freedom different? What makes reporters and journalists particularly more vulnerable? And how can the international legal architecture address those tailored vulnerabilities? So that's been, if I think about it, I've been a deputy chair. It's been my privilege the last year and a half, almost two. We're coming on two. And we've had 2 points of focus. One is to elaborate on the enforcement reports, those subject matter areas. When we engage states in bilateral, multilateral fora, especially the executive group, especially the co-chairs, it's a matter of prioritization. You have to have the political will to implement what is in the recommendations. And then, of course, as you can imagine, you put the 4 enforcement reports together, we have 400 beautiful pages of legal edifice and recommendations. Prioritization needs to happen, resources need to happen. So when we talk about how to make that a reality, that's the phase that we're in, to meet the states where they are. Not all states are going to have, it's not the same conversation with each state, but to tailor these recommendations in our bilateral, multilateral engagements to meet the states where they are. And then on top of that is what I call the moving with alacrity. As the high-level panel, we have to keep up with what the crisis, where the crisis is. And I'd like to tell you the situation in the world is safer for journalists, but it's actually much less safe. And I want to go into some table setting and focus on 2 things where we're doing even worse. One is cyber targeting of journalists. And I want to talk a bit about that table setting. And the second is accountability, which obviously dovetails with the investigative task force and where we are today. So table setting on cyber targeting. That has only increased. It's increased because of the prevalence and use of commercially available spyware. Can I ask how many of you have heard of Pegasus? Raise your hand. How many of you have heard of Predator? Raise your hand. Okay, so we know what the issue is out there in terms of spyware that literally using what's called no-click technology. You don't have to do anything. You don't have to download. You don't have to respond to an email. You do literally nothing when Pegasus comes into your phone and turns it into a microphone, recording device, and surveillance device. Imagine how powerful that can be when it gets on the cell phones and technology of journalists. And that goes to show, where are we today? We're in a world where we have journalists routinely every day being targeted and being taken out. And what do I mean by that? And we have a lot to thank our civil society colleagues in the information that we do know. According to the Pegasus Project, which is an investigative effort led by Paris-based journalists, nonprofit called Forbidden Stories in collaboration with media partners, more than 180 journalists in 21 countries have been tracked with Pegasus alone, which is just the tip of the iceberg. And we all know about Jamal Khashoggi, Leneg Bredou of France, Siddharth Varadarajan of India. All of these are the high-profile cases, but this is happening routinely. And we know that Pegasus obviously has been brought up to the fore in terms of being on sanctions lists in the United States. There's lawsuits pending all over the world. What about the next era? Predator. The more recent Predator files investigations, which were convened by the European Investigative Collaborations Media Network, Citizen Lab, Meta, they've documented suspected Predator customers in 11 countries. Amnesty International identified just one surveillance campaign which used Predator to target at least 50 social media accounts, including senior political officials in the European Parliament. the European Commission, the US Congress, the UN, the President of Taiwan, EU-based journalists, academic researchers, think tanks. It is prevalent. And the other aspect of this that I think is little spoken about is the disproportionate impact on women, on female journalists. And I'm going to give you a chilling statistics from UNESCO. So according to UNESCO, 73% of women journalists said that they had been in a survey threatened, intimidated, insulted online in connection with their work. The Coalition for Women in Journalism recorded 92 press freedom violations involving female journalists in January of this year alone, 20 cases of legal harassment, 11 of threats and intimidation, 8 of sexual harassment, 6 were detained, 9 physically assaulted, 3 were targeted on online harassment. It's a 253% increase in just 1 year over January of last year. We are in a crisis, and we are in a crisis in which the technology deployed is completely and comprehensively destructive. So I don't think it overstates things to say that when we as the high-level panel come to the issue of media freedom, we try to get at where we think the limitations are. And here in cyber targeting is one point of focus. You can imagine, for those that are not taken out entirely, the chilling effect that this has and what that means for our inability to access independent information, what that means for our democracies. So it's an issue not just for journalists, but all of us. And I don't need to tell this group for that. So in my view, it has to be an all of society effort. And by that I mean, and we thank our civil society organizations for shedding the light, putting the spotlight out there. You have the Pegasus files, you have the Predator files, you see what is being done. There are myriad lawsuits actually in at least 17 jurisdictions on Pegasus alone. So we're learning, we're understanding how these technologies are being deployed, and with that information comes power. But there are literally only, I'd say, 2 labs in the entire world that can help journalists in real time when their phones have been infected. So you think about Citizen Lab, Amnesty International. Do they have the resources they need to actually roll this out to journalists in real time all over the world? No, not yet. Why not when we're facing this kind of urgency? You have the participation of the private sector. That is critically important, where you have social media companies, large tech companies, who in conversations with them we know are very actively oriented and protective around making sure that this kind of technology is not misused and abused in violation of the human rights and with respect to journalists in particular. Those companies, I'll get to give you a sense, have committed resources to understanding how data exfiltration is working, resources to giving journalists tools to actually be able to detect these viruses on their various devices. But again, it's not enough. Very recently, the firm Paladin actually published a set, and this was just a month ago, among venture capital firms, a set of voluntary investment principles that committed firms to invest in companies only where there was a balancing, where the enhancement of defense, national security, and foreign policy interests was in the service of free and open societies, and that they invest only, and I'll quote from it, they commit to invest only in companies that sell to countries that abide by international law as recognized by the United States. Now, for those words to have meaning, of course, it's all about how is it implemented, who's watching, is it just voluntary? But again, these are the kinds of all of society efforts that we need. So the last piece of this is to think about our role is as an advisory body to states. So our job is to take all of this information, this knowledge, and to try in our independent function, advise states, here are the priorities, here's what we think is necessary. And we have, as the high-level panel, identified cyber targeting as a priority topic. And so have asked states to work with us to engage in pledges in how you bring this technology to bear. I note that our friends in the consultative network have called for an all-out ban until human rights principles can be fully accounted. What we are talking about in the high-level panel is thinking about these technologies which we know are going to be employed in certain contexts legitimately by law enforcement, national security. How do we live in a world where those technologies are used to battle crimes at the same time to bring human rights principles higher in the priority in the conversation so that they're not misused and abused? So that is a big part of the conversation. As you can imagine, drawing those lines is not easy, but that's why state prioritization and engagement is so necessary. So from a state's perspective, it's building that political will. So on the accountability, I'll be brief because I know we're going to be talking back to the investigative task force recommendations. I will say that it's been really wonderful to see how the Netherlands has championed the investigative task force. Any multilateral effort that doesn't die on a vine in international law is a win to me. And if it weren't for the Netherlands' commitment, this might have been one of them. So we are in the midst of the study, the Asser Institute, really this amazing group of experts, the high-level panels engaging. As you can imagine, it's all about the details. What does an international legal framework look like in an investigations context that's specifically tailored to crimes against journalists? How do we not reinvent the wheel? There's lots of programs out there, international, domestic, that look to try to prevent crimes in general. How are journalists differently situated? So one example is, for example, the forensics around Predator and Pegasus tracking when the surveillance technology is employed. That evidence is very particular. It's an example of, in a routine, ordinary investigation, there may not be the steps necessary taken to preserve that evidence to ensure that that evidence can be used and translated in a legal context when a prosecution comes on deck. At Debevoise, we, for example, represented a Sri Lankan journalist who had been assassinated through the use of these technologies, and it is a very complicated evidentiary showing to be able to actually show how the phone was used to track. So I think the investigative task force bringing to bear an internationalized group and body of experts is a step in the right direction. But of course, we're looking forward to engaging further with the Asser Institute on these details. So I'll leave it there and turn it back to you in terms of the next step.
Thank you, Catherine, for touching upon many of the issues, also the invisible side of things that I think if you are not within the world of looking at journalism and how cyber technologies are being used by the actors to silence journalists may not be known to many of us. We've heard of Pegasus, we've heard of Predator, but have we actually heard the details and how these technologies are being deployed? I also think it's a good reminder not to take journalism and access to information for granted. I think many of us who sit in this room just sort of open up our phones to get to The Guardian, New York Times, and don't really think about what it takes to get that information out there, and that there are many places in the world where that is not possible at the moment. And of course, as mentioned, this is an all-of-society problem that requires an all-of-society response. And with that, I would like to turn to Evelyn. And given your experience with Free Press Unlimited, may I ask you to highlight what strategies have been effective in protecting journalists at risk? Let's first focus on that, particularly in countries with limited press freedom.
Thank you so much, and thank you for having me. I'm delighted to be here as a civil society representative. So we are a press freedom organization based in the Netherlands. We support journalists and independent media across the world. We work with about 300 partners in more than 50 countries. These are mainly countries where press freedom is under pressure. But I must say, I've been with the organization for 8 years, and I'm not sure where it's not under pressure at the moment, to be honest. Even in the Netherlands, we have challenges that journalists face. We're about to publish a report this week about actually the legal intimidation of journalists in the Netherlands. And I would say that's also a very pressing issue that might be less visible at the moment. But I will try to sketch a little bit what we see over the last couple of years, and then from the doom and gloom go a bit into what might work. So we have a emergency fund for journalists at risk that is globally functioning, and we've had that since 2011. And just to illustrate, I think the magnitude of the problems we see today, which have been alluded to already, in 2011, we supported about 50 journalists a year, for instance, repairing a broken camera or getting a new computer after they had been attacked at a demonstration. Today, I think last year the number was, and I must peek a little bit, it was almost 1,600 journalists that we supported. And if I look at what the support is that we are able to grant, 1 out of 7 requests is for legal assistance. So speaking to you today, actually the law in many countries around the world is being abused against journalists and being used to silence them. I think that's a huge issue, and it's something that we are continuously working on. Another thing we see is the many conflicts around the world that affect the work of journalists. Right now in Gaza, we see the devastating effects of the attacks on journalists, which are not comparable to the attacks on civilians in general. There are 3 times higher chance of being killed as a journalist in Gaza. What we see very clearly is that these journalists are eyes and ears from the conflict, and that's why they are targeted. I would say in general, what we see, I think a lot of the other negative trends have been mentioned already. So we have public trust that has gone down, which is a big issue that is really related to economic viability issues that many journalists around the world face. So actually what you were just saying, Gabriele, at the end is, I think one of the main things that we see as a solution to safety issues is for people to pay for journalism, actually, because that's a way for journalists to create those systems internally, at least, to be safe when they go out and report. And it's also for us to value the intrinsic value of independent information and journalism as the fourth estate in our society. The last couple of years, we've been studying impunity quite deeply at the organization. And I think one of the main reasons why journalists are targeted more than compared to 2011 is actually because that fourth estate function is really under attack. When you look at Gaza, for instance, you also see very clearly that other pillars of accountability are very fragile. And that's what you see in all the countries around the world where journalists are murdered. The problem is not only that they are attacked, but the problem is also that the legal system is not functioning and that the politicians very, very often are the ones targeting journalists. So I think in terms of the responses we need, if you look at a silver bullet, we need this tide of authoritarianism to be reversed, and we need a democratic uprising, actually. But obviously, that's a bit challenging. So as an organization, we've been working with journalists to support them, and I think a way for them, apart from safety support that we provide, we also try to support them in collaborating cross-border, which is also a way for them to be more safe and to tell the stories that are crucial. And for the impunity issue, we have a couple of years ago, actually because we had been requesting states to act and upon their obligation to investigate attacks and murders against journalists, we decided we'll start doing that ourselves. So the last couple of years, we have been investigating cold cases of journalist murders, and we've done that in 17 cases of murders up till now. And it actually shows that it's possible to see, if you do a proper investigation from the start, you can find the perpetrator and you can see what the systemic failures are that are actually the basis for this impunity to be the result. So one of the things that we found, for instance, is that in many jurisdictions, there's an issue with transparency during an investigation. So many times the relatives of a murdered journalist have no way to find out what actually is happening in the investigation. When from the start they would have had legal counsel, they would have been able to see what was happening. They would have been able to follow and track and actually push for this accountability. So one of the, I think for us, the lessons learned is combining this legal counsel together with investigative journalism skills, is a way to actually fight the impunity and press for accountability.
Thank you, Evelyn. And thank you also for highlighting the moral outrage and the democratic uprising that I think has also been the trend through this conference of where we are now in the world. And just to follow up on some of the things that you mentioned, investigation seems to be the place where things break down. So there's either no initiation of investigation in the first place, which also keeps the issue completely in the dark, and it's even hard to get the numbers, of course, where there is no investigation, or investigations are conducted improperly without the technical tools, for example, and of course now it's getting more complicated, as Catherine mentioned, with the complexity of evidence when cyber attacks are involved. So Evelyn, from the perspective of your work at Free Press Unlimited, what would you say are some of the reasons why we are at this stage with investigations? Why are they not conducted properly? And is there a difference between perhaps conflict-related and non-conflict-related situations?
Yeah, of course. So I think it's important to state from the start that most journalists are murdered in what we call hybrid countries. So these are countries where there is a mix of democratic and autocratic features. So I think the perception is often the Chinas, the Russias of this world, that's where journalists are most attacked. But if you look at murders, there's no reason to murder them because they're already in prison or they're already silenced through other means. And I would say, sorry, my jet lag is kicking in. In terms of your question was whether investigations.
What are the reasons potentially behind those investigations breaking down and not being conducted properly?
Exactly. So these are quite diverse, I must say. We've worked in Pakistan, in Brazil, in Mexico. The reason can be very often that if you look at Mexico, for instance, there is this local power holder that's actually the mastermind behind the murder, who's also able to make sure that in the end the whole system doesn't work. So a murder can't be prosecuted because they're actually the ones behind it.
And I guess in conflict situations, we also have the issues of evidence and who is conducting the investigation, which I think that currently we also see these challenges with the Israel and Gaza conflict of who is looking at these killings and whether they are the regular course of conduct of conflict, which is usually what at least those in power would hide behind, or is it really something more targeted? And here I would like to go into more detail on the investigative task force and where it might offer some solutions or what type of modalities we actually need in order for this type of issue to be addressed with the task force. So now maybe Catherine, you could start with that and then I will give the floor to Chan.
Sure. So I think in terms of the task force itself, the structure, the scope, the kind of activity we expect is critical. And so all of it comes down to how do we do two things? One, don't recreate the wheel, in that, as you well know, Gabriela, from your work, there are actually a lot of existing mechanisms that are in the realm of failure of accountability. So there's expert panels and rosters, and there's programs in which that kind of expertise or resource sharing exists. There are models in which there's deployment models. So for example, the Federal Bureau of Investigation here in the United States has basically an illegal attaché program in which there is a crisis response group of experts comprised of investigators and prosecutors who are well versed in evidence and other aspects, who are deployed to different countries in order to hit the ground and be on the ground and assist. And then there's the more abstract, I would say, kind of advisory, where there's training programs and education and capacity building. So if you think about the efforts across those three, when you look at crimes against journalists, we have to ask ourselves, how can we add to the existing architecture that international legal institutions are already providing in a way that actually gets to why these crimes are on a greater rate being left with no measure of accountability. So in that respect, I think from the high-level panel and Nadim, and as you know, in conversations with you and the Asser Institute, we're very much focused on less of a here's a roster of experts and more of an active deployment model in the sense of thinking through what does that actually look like. And as you can imagine, there are a lot of issues of political will for host states who are where a crime actually happens. Is there the ability to engage that host state, go on the ground, collect evidence? That's going to be a threshold issue. There are questions about the right expertise, as we mentioned already, the cyber piece, but that's not the only. There's very specific evidentiary aspects. Is the right expertise getting there? There's an issue that doesn't get a lot of attention, which is how culturally sensitive are these internationalized investigative task force? And by that, I mean, do they understand the country, something as basic as the language? Or is there an ability to actually be perceived as a value add rather than parachuting in for 10 days and then leaving? And so there are real important questions of implementation. How do immunities work for this kind of body? Where is the funding going to come on a go-forward basis? Which is why I'm so grateful that the Asser Institute is working with high-level panel, with other key stakeholders, with states who have the political will to actually take this on. And I will say that we are in a moment, for all of the bad news, for all of the horror that we are experiencing, and for international lawyers, it hits very close to home as to being so far from the world that we imagined in the post-war order. One of the aspects that the horrors in Ukraine, for example, have brought up is this increased appetite for how do we think about international accountability. The ICC has actually had a bit of a renaissance, if you will, in terms of focus. We're thinking about crimes of aggression. We are prepared to do things differently. And from the high-level panel's perspective, we have to do it differently where it counts the most. And I honestly cannot think of what could be more important than protecting media freedom, because it's on that basis that as we do 50% of the world's elections this year, how can we have fair elections, a functioning democracy, protection of freedoms, unless we protect the information ecosystem? As Maria Ressa likes to say, we have a crisis in the information ecosystem. So I think the investigative task force is obviously not that magic bullet, but it does need to be tailored to where we need it for media freedom.
Thank you. And I, of course, have 77 follow-up questions, but Jan, would you like to add something?
Of course. I mean, I'd obviously echo all of that. I mean, just talking about statistics, 50% of the world is going to elections. 12% of the world has access to an independent and free media. 12%. So far as the accountability piece is concerned, the biggest challenge here is for legal experts, civil society, academic experts as well, to work in such a way as to provide recommendations that can be taken up, whereby those recommendations actually have impact. And the biggest challenge for the panel on Inception has not been writing the reports, very handsome as they are, but it's writing the reports with a view to thinking about which states may move first, which states may then join them, and so on and so forth. And these are not easy areas. We didn't pick a single easy area, and this investigative task force is particularly difficult. And that's why, just as when it came to the issue of safe refuge, it was so important to find a state to move first, and that state was Canada. And we have the beginnings of momentum here. We're extremely grateful to the Netherlands, but also extremely grateful to the Asser Institute and their partners. I mean, I think at the end of all of this, there will be a very strong work product, but we will then have to turn our minds to the states. And it could not come at a more important time.
And just to make the conversation even more difficult, now we're talking about something that is at least graspable.
Yes.
I think killings of journalists, that a response is needed. I think it is hard for a state to say, no, it's fine. Like they die and it's okay. I would like to bring attention to some of the issues that seem to be particularly intractable and raise perhaps even more resistance when talking to states about their responsibility, and that is the issue of arbitrary detentions, which, according to the data, tend to increase in countries which transition from open violence methods, and as Evelyn mentioned, the China, the Russia of this world. And it becomes this way of quietly silencing the journalists. And of course, some of those cases are very high profile. We think of Gershkovich currently imprisoned in Russia, but a lot of them we never hear about because there is nobody left to report if there is the constant threat of ending up in prison. And with surveillance technologies and cyber technologies, the journalists are even more at risk of actually becoming imprisoned before they publish the reports. And there have been wonderful initiatives from civil society of finishing the reports where the journalists were either killed or imprisoned at the time of working on it. So I just wanted to ask, is there something that could be done to either reduce, and I think the visa program is one of those things, the number of journalists who face arbitrary detention in the first place? But even more importantly, is there a way to use international law to fight the arbitrariness, or to expose the arbitrariness and actually have these individuals released? Jen, I see you would like to come in on that.
Perked up because this is another area that Catherine and I are working on very, very closely in the context of the high-level panel having to keep up with the new challenges. Of course, arbitrary detention is not a new challenge, but it is getting worse, and it's getting worse very, very quickly. And as Gabriella said, for every high-profile instance, there are 15 to 20 instances of journalists being arbitrarily detained, which aren't really picked up. Here, unfortunately, there are real gaps in the regional framework in terms of enforceable legal standards. The European Court of Human Rights traditionally has done a good job of enforcing an international minimum standard when it comes to arbitrary detention by reference to its Article 5 jurisprudence, and the cases have moved more quickly, but unfortunately some states now are not responding to orders from the court. But more broadly, there is the beginnings of an international initiative, again, led by Canada, but also with the United States, Japan, and a number of other countries, an international initiative against arbitrary detention. And we, as the high-level panel, have been feeding into that work so far as media freedom and journalists are concerned. There is an effort, I think, to give greater teeth to the UN working group on arbitrary detention. It's obviously very, very important to support existing UN efforts. But the question will be how? And now that initiative has 70 state signatories, and it is following a model which is not dissimilar to the Media Freedom Coalition. I think some of the good news stories from Media Freedom Coalition Canada has sought to replicate in its arbitrary detention initiative. That initiative started more from the perspective of arbitrary detention in state-to-state relations. You've got to start somewhere, and we have a member of the high-level panel who is one of the experts, Professor Hong, is a former president of the UN Working Group, advising that body now.
If I could just add on to that, because I think that this question also dovetails with another point, which is our tendency to think about the availability of the legal mechanisms really being human rights mechanisms, which are absolutely correct focus, but they're not exclusive, because this is not just a human rights issue, it's a rule of law issue. And the reason I mention that is because for everyone in the room that are working in human rights, but also in other areas of international law, this is, again, all of society effort. I think we have to use all of the arrows in our quiver. And part of that is other areas of law. And with respect to arbitrary detention, I'll give you an example of, in the context of investment arbitration, we represented an organization or an entity, a company that was operating in Albania, who was subjected to a series of harassment and other actions by Albania because it was the only independent news source in the country. Ultimately, those actions resulted in the shutdown of this media organization, all of its individuals basically dispersed, and the chief proprietor being threatened with detention. And what we were able to do is get an investment tribunal up and running and used the opportunity to obtain provisional measures to get the first provisional measures in the context of investment arbitration, binding provisional measures that put a stop to a pending indictment that was clearly motivated by the campaign of harassment against the media organization, and ultimately prevailed on that. 2 years later, after much briefing and a merits hearing, we were able to win a $110 million euro judgment against the state of Albania, which goes into the ICSID system, which has real enforcement teeth. And if you think from a jaded perspective, what gets states to stand up and pay attention, it's having a 110 million euro damages award. But at the end of the day, it was about media freedom arising in the context of investment arbitration. So it goes back to full toolkit. This media freedom is something that manifests not just in human rights, and arbitrary detention, not just in human rights, but in other areas of law that we should be thinking about.
Thank you, and it is really refreshing to hear that something actually has worked. I think in the context of our work, that is
They haven't paid yet, but still working.
It is a work in progress, at least not a work in regress.
Yes.
And I would like to give the floor to Evelyn to add from the civil society perspective. What have been some of the things that work?
Yes, of course. So I would say in terms of detention, what we see really works very well if journalists have access to legal counsel very, very quickly. Often that is a big deterrence to pull through. What we also see in terms of political support, what is really helpful is when states come and monitor a case, come to trial, show up and show that they are actually following what is happening. Very often we see that if that happens more orchestrated, so for instance by the EU, or several member states of the EU and the US, then that has a deterrent effect, which we would like to see more of, I must say. But definitely we see that as a good practice.
Can I just add to that, because that is something where the Media Freedom Coalition has moved the dial in the right direction. They've set up these diplomatic networks whereby the key Media Freedom Coalition states are talking to each other not only through central government, but also through their embassies and their consulates. And that makes the sort of trial watching and observations, I think it's made it more coordinated. There's still a bit of coordination to go, but it can make a real difference, I think.
And just dovetailing on that as well, the coordination between civil society, the states, the legal professionals, experts, Media Freedom Coalition, where do you see that working and where do you see that perhaps breaking down? I am also thinking of the new task force and considering where it would slot in. Is there a place where there is a meeting place for all of these actors that are working on these issues, or is it something that still needs to be developed further? I think Evelyn is ready to jump in.
I think the Media Freedom Coalition has been a really good convening, how do you say that, forum in that sense. Last year at World Press Freedom Day, we had strategic sessions where we discussed multiple issues from different perspectives. So both the high-level panel, the consultative network members, and the states were there. But I think this could happen way more often, where we convene and actually set our agendas and make sure that we don't work in silos as much as we tend to do. But I would fully agree with Chan that in terms of casework, we see the Media Freedom Coalition is actually, with the diplomatic networks, created something that wasn't there before. So, for instance, when we raise a case of a journalist that is arrested somewhere in the world or that is being persecuted on other grounds, this is a way for us to directly speak to several states at the same time and ask them for action. So I feel that's key. But I feel in terms of fighting impunity, there's also definitely other actors that we need on board.
And on the other actors, but also on the Media Freedom Coalition, currently the Media Freedom Coalition counts over 50 states. The representation is also very uneven, as with many of those progressive human rights coalitions. Where do you think more work could be done, and where there actually is political momentum to get more states on board to have a broader representation, especially from countries where you have pressing media freedom concerns? I don't know who would like to jump in on this one.
It's not an easy one.
It's not an easy one.
Must be Catherine Emma.
Must be
This is the typical dynamic as our deputy chair. Softballs,
that I just
hardballs.
benefit from this as a moderator.
I think that certainly the prior co-chairs and the current co-chairs are very cognizant of what it means to be and the importance of diversity within the Media Freedom Coalition. There are efforts at every stage to make it, I think, more geographically diverse and make sure that regions are represented. There is some structural difficulties with that because in order to be part of the Media Freedom Coalition, you need to actually be able to say we are a state that prioritizes media freedom, are willing to sign on to some pledges and work with the high-level panel, work with the consultative network. So you could say that there's a structural impediment to getting states in the coalition where perhaps the greatest need arises. So you have inherent in the enterprise this tiering of states, if you will, which isn't necessarily helpful. But at the same time, you can't have a media freedom coalition with lots of states who don't prioritize media freedom. So as you can imagine, it's a balancing. It's trying to bring states along who are outside of the MFC so that at some point they can come into the MFC. It's taking states like Afghanistan, where there's been a change in government, where you cannot actually say that media freedom exists, and they come out of the MFC. So it is a constant dialogue. I think the chairs know that it's very politically sensitive, but extremely important. So I can say that we're very pleased that the MFC is paying attention to this issue and trying to increase diversity. But as I mentioned, you have to balance it with some of these structural limitations.
I see. Yes, Jen.
I just add, and I should have said this at the outset, states who are not in the MFC but would like to join the MFC are able to come to the high-level panel and ask for expert advice on legislation that they're considering on safety of journalists, media freedom, and we have engaged with those states as well. So we're sort of trying to do our best from a sort of capacity building perspective. The point about the earlier point you made, a question that you asked, Gabriella, about civil society, experts and states. I mean, at the very, very start of our work in 2019, I mean, we had a non-derogable rule, which is that no work of the high-level panel, less any of these advisory reports where we're advising the states en masse, was going to proceed without very broad and deep consultation. And we put a lot of effort in talking to civil society, which is why the recommendations in the reports were endorsed, I think, by so many members of civil society as well as mandates. It takes longer, but ultimately it has a much greater impact and legitimacy when you go to the states with those recommendations, and that has been absolutely critical to our work.
And of course, we do have consultative network
Yes.
at the table as well. I would just like to ask one more question, and then I would like to take questions from the audience. If there are any questions, please take space at the microphones in the middle. But just in the meantime, and I will start with Evelyn, because you mentioned your work I mentioned the work, and you did it as well, on the cold cases, and actually taking up the work of investigations in the absence of any other type of intervention. So really in situations where there is nowhere to turn anymore. And I think from our conversations before, some of this work is being done remotely. So I also wanted to have a slightly more positive spin, perhaps, on technology, about which we have been hearing very concerning panel interventions throughout this conference and today. How do you think technology might be leveraged to actually conduct investigations or to advance media freedom, so the other side of the coin?
I would say that we have indeed been able to work with a team of investigators based partly in Amsterdam and partly in the countries where these murders happened. So in that sense, technology is very helpful because I think it's a way for us to guide local investigators in their work. I would say also the option of OSINT, so open source investigations, is something that's really valuable in looking at these murders. I must say for us, because we have been looking at older cases, cold cases, because of the risks involved in looking at hot cases that have just happened, it's sometimes a bit harder to do that with technology because a lot of the evidence is not available in terms of open source information. But I would say that if I can say some hopeful words, that even still, I think when we look at these cases that are called for 12 years even, it is possible when you actually collect the good group of people, so people with legal expertise who can devise a legal strategy and who know what evidence you need to go to court or to reopen a case. And you work with investigative journalists who understand the environment very well and understand how to find the evidence and how to speak to witnesses. I think we can see that there's a lot of opportunities to reopen cases and to also find more structural issues that can be tackled even today and that matter to the environment for journalists to work in. Yeah, so I would. So I'm not sure if I've answered your question completely, but I would see there are definitely opportunities, but I see a bit of both.
I think there is no complete answer, but I'll give the floor to Catherine.
Just very briefly before we get to questions, I'm very glad you mentioned this because I think we can sometimes get in the mode of thinking of technology as only a problem, when in fact it can actually be a very powerful solution. And one of the greatest areas that gives me hope is I think there's so much more potential for public-private collaboration to solve some of the world's most difficult problems, and this is no exception. And in this instance, so as an example, we have some of the biggest tech companies focused on this sufficiently to think about how do you employ, for example, artificial intelligence in a positive way here. And one example that comes to mind is I sit on the board of Human Rights First, and we've had some really remarkable success in that organization using AI to basically do a scraping of the internet to find patterns and bots around white supremacist movements, for example, take that information and bring it to bear in various advocacy and various accountability and other mechanisms. So it's AI is just one example of a very powerful way to be able to track what's happening on the internet, understand where bots and disinformation campaigns come from, and be able to employ that in various legal accountability mechanisms. So I have reason to be hopeful that technology can be helpful in this regard.
Thank you. And we'll take questions from the audience now. So the two in the back, and then we'll go to the front microphone. Yes, go ahead.
Hello, this is Charles Siratak. I'm a second-year law student at Syracuse Law, and I have a question for the entire panel, which is, does the state where an intelligence company is located have an international legal obligation not to license the export of this technology to conflict zones specifically?
I think we'll take all the three questions and then we'll turn to responses.
Good morning. Thank you for this panel. This is directed at Evelyn, Natasha Fain, Human Rights Litigator. Regarding the impunity and the accountability piece, can you talk about your work with local attorneys and groups to basically help you identify the leverage points? For example, I can think of countries in Central America with wonderful laws on the books regarding something like commercial sexual exploitation of children, but the way that they've worked out the prosecutorial discretion, it means that this is not prosecuted. And so you could develop a beautiful case, investigate it properly, give it to the people, and then nothing would happen. And you need local know-how for that. So I'm kind of curious to see how you're working on that in this context.
Thank you. And one more question.
Yes, thank you. This question is for the full panel. So how does this concentration of digital power in big tech companies impact the ability of journalists to have journalistic independence and freedom of uphold freedom of the press and also access information globally? And what international law frameworks do you feel like we have to meet to address those challenges?
Thank you. Who would like to start the first question on licensing exports of technology?
I can take a crack at that one and then pass the baton. I think that in a lot of instances, we're seeing the test of precisely that legal question in the context, for example, the various Pegasus lawsuits. And in the Pegasus lawsuits, they're asking the basic question of what is the legal liability for developing a company that is responsible for developing the underlying technology for the ultimate use, if you will, where it is foreseeable that that ultimate use would be unlawful and illegal. What is the responsibility of the company that develops the tech in the first instance? Now, I say that it's mostly been thus far a domestic law conversation, but in these various jurisdictions, depending on whether it's a monist or dualist system and how international legal standards are manifest, it's actually also an international legal question about how you draw the lines on that kind of prohibition. So this is currently playing out in, at least by last count, I think 16 jurisdictions in which the Pegasus technology has been challenged. So I think it's watching and waiting and seeing how that manifests and how that crystallizes. But it's going to be a really difficult legal line to draw when it comes to causation, attribution, foreseeability. But it is certainly very much front of mind and on deck in these various pending proceedings.
And that, of course, tracks with other technologies as well.
Yes.
So I think that will be sort of a joint conversation when it comes to assisted targeting systems or autonomous weapons. And we've had some of these interventions during the conference, but of course, some of that work is already being taken up by international crimes investigators, also thinking how to conduct investigations that would show attribution and foreseeability that might be of use then later on when we talk about technologies like Pegasus or Predator and some of these more diffuse ways of intervening as well.
That's right. And also in the export control context, where you have the conversation about dual use technologies and where you draw lines of responsibility. So it's hitting a lot of different international legal regimes.
Yes, it will be an exciting decade on this front. On the second question on work with local attorneys, for example, in Central America, and taking it from investigation to prosecution. Maybe Evelyn?
Yeah, of course. Thanks so much for that question. I was looking where you were. So, for instance, in the case of Pedro Palma, who was a journalist murdered in Brazil, in Rio. And what we did is we worked with his widow, and together with legal counsel, we were able to access the case files for the first time. So that took quite a while, I must say, because they were buried in, I think, a room for 10 years. Then we were able, together with the lawyer, to look at the case files and actually request new investigative acts, because we found out that they hadn't heard any witnesses that were at the scene at the time of the murder. And that resulted in the case to be reopened. I mean, this is still ongoing. All of these cases, this is like long breath, but I'm not sure. I think you're the audience who understands that very well. So we feel, together with a lawyer, if you're able to work with the family, which is one of the requirements to actually work on these cases, you can create real opportunities for justice. For instance, in Mexico, we also investigated several cases. And with that new evidence, we could actually go to the federal prosecutor, who was able to review the cases. Also, that's still ongoing, but we're continuing together with legal counsel to press for these cases to be solved. So that's just a couple of examples, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah.
Can I just add to that, Evelyn? It really was an excellent second question. When it comes to prosecutors and the exercise of prosecutorial discretion, obviously sometimes just a political act, but sometimes it's because there's a lack of capacity or training or a lack of understanding where human rights may fit in. I mean, the panel has been working to support UNESCO's efforts in the training of prosecutors in that regard. But the reason I wanted to intervene was actually the second part of your question, because I think local legal assistance is absolutely essential. But that local legal assistance has to be expert. It needs to be firms or individuals who really understand the issues. One of the problems that we've been seeing, not only on the panel, but I think as practitioners, especially is, there are very well-meaning early interventions, but sometimes steps that need to be taken are not taken. And that severely limits what you can then do on the international or regional plane by way of practical and effective recourse. And we've been doing a lot of work to ensure that these various private sector initiatives to ensure that pro bono legal assistance is provided in jurisdictions where it's very, very difficult, is actually informed by expertise as well as a willingness to proceed pro bono, and I think that's absolutely critical.
Well, I think that's also behind our thinking for investigative task force. In a way, a shoddy investigation or investigation that is not conducted in time or within the standards that are necessary is the breaking point for any willing or unwilling state to actually conduct prosecutions. So as a first step, and as a step that is very difficult to redo, you can try to redo a prosecution and the proceedings in court if you have the evidence and they have not been presented properly, but you cannot redo an investigation, or you can, but it is extremely difficult, as Evelyn has laid out for us. So in our thinking of what investigative task force would do in this context is to make sure that those first steps are conducted appropriately and taken to prosecutors or to the legal counsel that can actually bring it to the level of prosecution. Because that is really the part of the work that is very difficult to do. It is timely, it requires expertise, and it has to be done properly the first time.
Yeah, if I may add a little bit to this, what we saw when we were looking at the couple of cases that have been solved in the last 10 years, those were actually, I think, with one exception, they were all solved by specialized prosecutors. So I think that's also something that really shows how much you need this special investigations. You need to understand very well what's the connection between the murder and the freedom of expression, the work of the journalists. So these are things that are very often overlooked when investigations are done. Just to add.
Yes, and I think we've seen similar challenges with some international crimes investigations as well. The linkage is the part that breaks down when domestic law enforcement is for the first time perhaps dealing with that kind of situation. Just put to that last question and the effects of the concentration of power in big companies. I think it was also mentioned in several panels, the fact that states may not have complete control over companies and that they are, of course, multinational corporations, and it's more difficult to enforce, and what effect it has on free press, and what international law frameworks do we have to respond to that, to control the big companies. I think everyone's ready to go, Catherine.
Sure. Have you noticed a pattern of the hardball questions?
You're just too close
exactly.
to me.
Just redressing the balance for all the other panels.
So I think there's two aspects to it. One is the regulatory aspect, and that is the potential and obvious need of states to regulate, get ahead of where companies are developing this kind of technology and selling this technology. What is the responsibility of those multinational companies? Often, a lot of the business and human rights, not often, for the most part, those are voluntary principles. Those are permissive principles and regimes. So it does require political will to actually either crystallize those into hard law norms, or take the soft law norms, which I take very seriously enough to engage companies. So there is what I call the regulatory enforcement piece. But there's also the piece that sometimes we have to take a minute and challenge ourselves and not assume bad actor on multinational corporations, in the sense that the public-private collaborations are too often overlooked. Because if we can harness the resources of the private sector geared towards the priority of media freedom protection, that is power. That is where you actually have impact. That's getting beyond words and the lexicon. It's actual impact. And so I would think of it both in terms of regulatory, but also the opportunity, because I think in engaging, in our experience on the high-level panel, and my experience in my own practice is when you engage multinational corporations, they want to do the right thing. And it's a matter of how do you actually implement that? How do you bring that to bear in a meaningful way? So I think it's both aspects that we need to focus on.
I mean, I would only add that, we are getting into very much sort of hard law in this area, certainly in Europe with the Digital Services Act. I mean, the obligations now on the very large platforms are considerable. And, Catherine made a very good point about, the full toolkit and potentially deploying investor-state arbitration, for instance. In here, the EU is going to seek to do that through not only calling them out, but using its considerable powers with fines if they do not comply. Whether or not that is the right solution, we will see, but we are there now, and those obligations have started to bite as of last summer. And what will be, I think, quite interesting, I mean, we've got international lawyers in this room, is how that regulatory framework, which is now at the regional level, will play out in the courts eventually. And I think Europe will be a very, very interesting testing ground for some of these issues.
Evelyn would like to have the last word.
Yeah, I think we're very hopeful that the Digital Services Act in at least Europe, but hopefully have a more universal global effect, because yeah, I mean, the online space for journalists right now is very unsafe. There is hardly any accountability. And I think what we hope to see is actually this shift from the regulation to a lot more openness and accountability on the parts of the platforms themselves. So I do agree that we shouldn't always be antagonistic about this, but we do feel that there's a real need for action there to make sure that we can harness the opportunities that the online space would give to journalists and to media freedom.
Thank you. And thank you to all the panelists looking at the time. We touched upon quite a few issues, and I hope that we gave more clarity than confusion or questions. So I think questions is always a good thing to take away from these conferences. So I would like to thank the speakers. I would like to thank all of you for being here on Saturday morning. And I'll hand the word to Greg to finish off the session.
Yeah. Thank you. That was a wonderful way to conclude our meeting. Just the centrality of this to human rights, to democracy, to the rule of law, and to accountability. I just want to thank again the Municipality of The Hague and the TMC Asser Institute, Pepine, Marielle. Thank you so much. And then just a quick announcements is that next year, it'll be April 13th to 16th. We'll have our 119th annual meeting here. In Chicago, we'll have our mid-year meeting on November 15th and 16th. And in Geneva, we'll have our ASIL Abroad meeting on June 5th and 6th. So I hope to see you at these coming meetings. And then finally, we're going to have our reception. It's going to be outside in the Heights courtyard, and I am told there are going to be heaters that all function. So please come join us up there.